Hello class, welcome to the next segment in the week 3 material, and in this segment we're going to take a look at what happens when we have range that has a range function that has two numbers in it, and we're also going to take a look at what exactly happens with this variable that appears after the word for in the case of a for loop. So what actually is going on here is when we have this variable out in front, so we have for I in range, in this case we have a variable I, that is actually going to be assuming some set of numerical values or some set of values that is something that's going to be predefined. And to understand what those values are actually going to be, we first have to take a look at the range function. So in the previous case, we had the range function with just a single number in here. Now we've got range with two numbers in here, and you can see that the two numbers are separated by a comma. And what this does is this defines the bounds of what I refer to as our looping variable I. And the first number inside this, when you have range with two numbers in it, the first number defines what the starting value of I is, so our looping variable I in this case. And this also the second number in the range function defines what our upper bound for our looping variable is. So in the case of this particular example, we want the computer to start, we want the value of I to start out being 1. And then each time we go through the loop, the value the value of I, the numerical value that I is holding on to, each time we go through the loop, the value of I will increase by 1. So the first time we go through the loop, I will assume the starting value here, which is 1. Then the next time we go through the loop, the next cycle through, I will go up to 2. And then the next cycle to the loop, I will go up to 3, and then it will keep doing that until we reach the upper bound. So if that is in fact what's going on here, then by running this print statement on line 3 here, we're just simply printing out what the value of I is. Then we would expect to see the computer just start counting at 1, then it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then at some point it's going to stop. But I want you to pay very close attention to what the final value of I is when we go to run this program and get some sort of result in the console. And you can see I does in fact start off at 1, but you'll notice that the upper bound 10 does not appear in the program's output. And that's something that's very important to keep in mind. When you've got a range function when you've got the range that has two numbers in it, we start at this number and the computer will go up to, but not including the second number. So this upper bound is something that's non-inclusive. The computer is not actually going to, the value I is never going to actually assume the value of 10. It will go up to, but not including 10. Which in this case means the maximum value of I is going to be just 9. So 9 is up to but not including 10. So if I wanted to include 10, then I can just simply adjust the upper bound here accordingly. So here I would say for range 1, starting at 1 and then go up to but not including 11. In this case, that would mean that the variable I will in fact attain a final value of 10 before the loop terminates. And you can see we can in fact confirm that result just to do a simple deduction by what we see in the console here and the fact that we're printing out what the value of I is through each cycle of the loop that we've defined. So I'll go ahead and set that back to be 10. And one thing that I'll also go ahead and mention is there's nothing special about this variable that we have here. So I could also say for j in range 1, 10, and this will give me the exact same output as long as I'm consistent with my variable names. So in this case, j will start off at 1, and it will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, just like I. There's nothing special about that variable. You can use any variable name at all as long as it's valid Python syntax. In fact, if I want to do something that's completely over the top, I could run this example down at the very bottom. For supercalifragilisticexpialidocious in range 1, 10, probably not a looping variable you're going to be using very frequently, but this is just to sort of illustrate the point that this variable name doesn't matter as long as it is a valid Python variable name. But you'll see that I get the same exact result as long as I use the same variable name. It doesn't matter what the name of the variable is. The only thing that matters is that I'm consistent with it. So I'll go ahead and actually put this back to be I. Now, one thing I'm also going to go ahead and introduce, which may not seem like a big deal right now, but this is something that will immensely help you, especially if you're very new to this idea, because you can see how we can use the for loop to get the computer to assume some list of regularly spaced numbers. So in this case, 1 by 1, the variable I is taking on a nice evenly spaced interval of numbers here, starting with 1, then going to 2, then the 3. So we can get the computer to take a variable and then make it assume a nice pattern of numbers one by one, and depending on what our end goal might be, we can then do something with that pattern of numbers. In fact, this will become most significant when we start talking about Python lists and other more complicated data structures, but for now, this is just designed to give you sort of initial bearing on what exactly is going on. But I do want to go ahead and introduce something that is sort of an illustrative tool that you can use, especially if this is something that's very new to you, and will help you better see what exactly is going on here and what exactly your program is doing. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So here we have the same loop that we have here. And one of the things that I advocate for, when, especially if you're very new to this, is to make a table of values and have a column dedicated to each relevant piece of information, that is all the variable names, or even keeping track of which cycle number you're actually going through the loop. So in this case, we only have one variable, and we have that's the only piece of information that the computer is hanging on to. If we have more variables, then we might have more relevant pieces of information to keep track of. And if that's the case, then we might have more columns in our table. But for now, just as a super simple example to sort of illustrate what exactly I'm talking about, let's just take a look at a very simple case of having only one variable to worry about, which is I, and then also keep track of the cycle number. And basically, the number that goes in this column, that's basically where I'm at in the loop. So a cycle number of 1 means it's my first time going through the tasks that are part of the loop. Cycle number of 2, meaning which would mean that it's the second time going through the set of tasks, and a cycle number of 3 would mean that's the third time going through the loop. So let's go ahead and just start filling up this table just to sort of kind of illustrate what exactly I'm talking about. So a cycle number of 1, that is our first time through the loop. I starts off being this value of 1 here, so that we'll just simply go here. And if we had other variables in our program to worry about, then we would have other columns, another column to this table, or other columns to this table, and we'll also take a look at what those values would be as we go through each cycle. But this is just a very super simple example, just to sort of illustrate what exactly I mean by making a table for your loop. And if we go to the second cycle number, that is the second time through the loop, then we can determine that, well, I starts off being 1, and the computer will count up by 1 as we go through each new cycle. So if I starts off as 1 in the first cycle, then I will be 2 in the next cycle, because the computer is just counting up by 1 every time. And then the third cycle will give me the same idea. It's just the variable I is just going to count up by 3. And in this particular case, the variable I is just equal to the cycle number itself. And there are some loops where this is not going to be the case. In fact, in general, this is not going to be the case. And we'll take a look at one specific example of that in the next segment. But if we just follow that pattern through, we can deduce that the variable I is just equal to the cycle number itself. So the 8th time through the loop, the variable I is just equal to 8. And then the 9th time through the loop, the variable I is just equal to 9. And then since we don't include this upper bound here, we don't go through the loop a 10th time, which means the variable I is never equal to 10, meaning the final value of I, when the loop is all said and done, will in fact be 9. And one other thing that might be worth pointing out is you can put anything in this range function at all, as long as it's an integer. So I could in fact have, say, a separate variable, in this case x, and then I could also do for I in range 1 comma x. And in this case, the computer will look up what the value of x is, which from visual inspection we can see is equal to 10, and it will substitute that value of x in for this particular place in the range function. So in this case, this is just simply going to produce the same exact result that we had before, but this is just to sort of illustrate that you can put variables inside this range function as long as those variables have integers in them, or are integers themselves, meaning they don't contain decimal points. If you try to have a variable that has a decimal point, then you'll get this error message if you attempt that. So you can put anything at all in this range function. You can put a number in, you can put a variable name, as long as the end product of what you're putting in the range function is an integer of some sort. But that's going to do it for this segment, taking a look at what happens with our looping variable, and also seeing what happens when we have a range that has 2 numbers in it. And in the next segment, we're going to take a look at what happens when you have range with 3 numbers in it. So with that, I will see you all in the next segment.